It's amazing to me to think that the premiere episode of Batman the Animated Series aired in 1992. This series, which was largely inspired by the Tim Burton Batman films, but also strongly influenced by the Art Deco art style. This animated series marks a shift in the way cartoons are produced, and it would ultimately appeal not just to children or Batman fans, but to adults as well. And this series went an awful long way to redefining what Batman was and who he was, and also what an animated TV show could be, and what it could offer to its audience. This series reached for something a little bit higher than just the biff bang pow that we'd seen in other cartoons, and it started something of a trend in superhero animated series of the time. We would go on to see the X-Men series and the Spider-Man animated series, which would also draw on this inspiration of being able to tell more adult stories for children. And the result was a smash hit. This animated series was incredibly popular, and it's gone on to have an enduring legacy, so that we are still talking about this animated series all these years later. And of course, being a child when this series aired, this made an indelible impression upon me as a child, and I've maintained a lifelong love with this series. At the time, of course, they did release a number of toys to tie in. Kenner was the first to acquire the license, and it was a very successful line with multiple waves that seems to have captured every character you could imagine in the TV show. And they even managed to throw in an assortment of vehicles to really build this world up. Now, it would be natural to assume that this toy line would have a natural lifespan for the duration of the cartoon, and that would be the end of it. And for the most part, that was the case, until a few years ago, DC Collectibles acquired the license to make a brand new line of toys based on Batman the Animated Series. They ran two lines simultaneously, one for the original animated series and one for the final New Adventures, which had a slightly different artistic style and updated a majority of the characters. I was absolutely delighted when this line was announced, and I couldn't wait to get my hands on them. So as part of a series of videos, I'm going to be taking an overview of these figures. I personally opted to support just the animated series figures, those original characters, as that's my personal preference, so I didn't collect the majority of the New Adventures. So these videos are just going to focus on the figures from the early part of the animated series. So in today's video, I'm going to start off by looking at Batman and the Batman family. Basically, just the good guys. Naturally, I'll start off with Batman. Now, the first thing I probably should note that this is, of course, the Batman that came with the searchlight. So he's a little bit different in the sense that he actually has a material cape. This can be used to allow him to sit into some of the vehicles like the Batmobile and the Batwing that I'll be looking at in another video. But the sculpt of the figure is pretty much identical to the basic cartridge release. And I have to say the design is absolutely pitch perfect. This is bringing what we see on screen to life. They've perfectly caught the animation style in this figure, and it looks wonderful. The articulation is also very, very strong. Now, in some of the early releases, there were definitely some quality control issues, so you do have to be careful when you're bending some of these limbs, just in case they snap off, because they are hard plastic. Now, he has a ball joint in the head, which means, of course, he can spin his head from side to side, and he can also move it up and down. This works better in some figures than others. In Batman, it's pretty decent, but it's not a huge range of motion. He does have those ball-jointed shoulders, and again, they look like they're going to go out further than they actually do. They go out a fair distance, but not as far as you might hope. He does have a ball joint at the elbow, so although it is a single joint and it bends 90 degrees, more or less, it also swivels and rotates 360 degrees, so this is really good, and this makes up for the lack of a double joint. He does have a peg at the wrist, which is also hinged, so he can rotate his fists at 360 degrees, and of course he can hinge them up and down as well. There's no articulation in the upper torso, but he does have a swivel at the waist, which allows him to spin from side to side. He does have a literal hinge at the hip there, so you can see that his legs do kick out very, very far to the side there. It's not necessarily the best look. It looks okay when it's in there, but when you kick them out, it doesn't look fantastic. In truth, that hinge is pretty obvious and kind of ugly, but that said, it does allow a lot of movement, so he can kick his leg forwards and backwards a good distance as well, which is great. He's got single jointed knees, which bend to about roughly 90 degrees, and he's also got a swivel pivot at the ankle. Now, in terms of accessories, it depends largely on which version you've picked up, because they have done multiple releases of the straight Batman, but provided you have the one with the rubber cape, he will also come with extra sets of hands, some more open than others. He'll have his grapple gun, both loose and also moulded in hand, so it looks perfectly sculpted and there's no danger of it falling out. This is a really nice touch. And of course, he'll also have a Batarang. Now, they did also do a special release of a Batman Expressions pack. Basically, this is Batman with a bunch of different alternate heads, including a Bruce Wayne head, a Battle Damage head, a Shocked head. You get the idea. But he also has a couple of different capes, one that's straight, one that's more animated, so he's mid-action, and a whole host of extra goodies, such as a baseball bat, a knife, guns, you name it. Overall, I absolutely adore this figure. He is probably the king of the collection, which is perfectly fitting as, of course, he is the linchpin of the collection. You've got to have your Batman, and he is immense. So he stands very well on his own, but he looks even better when we add in some of the other characters as well. Next up, we have the Robin, and again, this is incredibly screen accurate, this looks really good, but of course Robin is a lot more colourful, so I think he's a lot more vibrant and he looks a lot more interesting to the eye. But once again, I really couldn't fault the sculpt. I think it's absolutely perfect, spot on. They've done an incredible job with this. But with Robin, we do start to see some of the weaknesses with this line, and that is because they've been so literal with their sculpts that they are not designed in a very realistic way, so characters tend to be quite top heavy and have very, very small feet or very small ankles which don't support the weight very well, which can make posing very difficult. Now, I won't go over the articulation again because it is largely the same as the Batman, but there are a few subtle differences. So you'll see with the head, this is an example of one where the head has a lot more freedom. It's the same joint, but he's a lot less restricted and his head can go up and down a lot further. Likewise, those ball jointed arms as well in the shoulders, he can kick his arms out a lot further than Batman can, which is really good. But he also has some extra articulation, so we can see at the wrist there, the end of the glove, there's actually articulation there which allows it to swivel 360 degrees, which is really cool. And we see the same thing at the top of the boot, so again, allowing a lot greater articulation there, so that's really cool. But again, you can see the weakness in the ankles. He doesn't have the ankle rockers, and this makes it a lot more difficult to pose him, especially as he's liable to fall over a lot of the time. Again, my Robin here is the one that was released with the bat signal, so he's the one that has the flexible cape made out of material, but in the original carded release you can see he actually came with 2 capes, which creates 2 different looks for him, and he also comes with a series of extra hands, his grapple gun, and his bowler, I think it is. But you'll notice that each figure does come with its own display stand, which is really cool and in some cases is desperately needed. And they've added some character animations to the stand as well, which is a really nice extra touch. I've never been much of a Robin fan, but I do really like him in the animated series, and I think they've done a fantastic job in this figure of him here, and I'm really, really glad to have him in the collection, and I think he looks pretty cool. Especially when we put the dynamic duo together. I think this is a really cool look, and yeah, I love how the colours complement each other perfectly, and I just think it's a really, really great design. One of the later releases in the line is the Batgirl, and although I think the sculpt and design is really nice, this is definitely a figure that I've really, really struggled to pose, and that's where the design really hinders the practical application on a figure like this. You'll notice I've had to use the display stand because there is no other way of showing off, because she will not stand on her own 2 feet. And as you can see here, the feet are incredibly small and the ankles are absolutely tiny, so there's no way it's going to support the majority of poses. Now, she does have the rubber cape, but it's really incredibly flexible, so it's no hindrance whatsoever to the articulation, and it's strong enough to always look pretty decent whatever position you've got her in, so that's really well handled. She does of course have the long hair piece as well, which is a hard plastic, so this does limit the articulation a little bit. It's not terrible though, as you'll see you can still move the head from side to side, and it can kind of look down, it can't really look up to be honest. You are very limited with the articulation when it comes to looking up and down, but she can move her head from side to side, which is great. She does more or less have the same articulation as we've seen in the other figures, which is a real boon because obviously her joints are a lot smaller, she's a lot more delicate, but they still manage to get a good range of articulation in there, which is really good. So, and like the Robin, she has the swivel at the base of the glove there as well, which is really good. Now, one of the things I found with mine is that you can swap out the hands, but it's very, very difficult to get them back in, so you have to work a little bit on that peg hole, which is going to be tricky. She doesn't have any waist articulation or ab crunch or anything at all. And of course she does have those hinged hips there, but when they kick out it's really very noticeable and it really doesn't look very good, to be honest. And also she can't really kick her legs forwards, they kind of are always forced coming out to the side. She can kick them back a fair distance, which is unusual, but going forwards not so much. For accessories, she does come with her display stand. She has a batarang, a pair of closed fists, a pair of open hands, another pair of open hands, and another pair of hands that's halfway between open and closed. So it looks a little bit like they've gone a bit overkill with the amount of hands you get, but hey, I'd rather have them than not. Now, this figure was pretty difficult to get hold of at the time, and it took me a long time to actually track it down. I'm really glad I have her in the collection. I think the design is very nice. However, as a toy, I don't think it's the most practical. It's where the art style really compromises the toyetic quality, I suppose. So she's not really that posable and not that dynamic in the collection. And here are the three of them together, and they do look really cool when they're all put together, to be fair. I love the complementary and contrasting designs and colours of the costumes, and yeah, it's a good look. So yeah, she's definitely worth having, but yeah, there are a few issues. Moving on to Commissioner Gordon, we're once again seeing a brand new mould here, so this is completely different to anything we've seen before. He's a lot bigger, a lot chunkier character, and I have to give kudos to DC Collectibles really for taking on this challenge, because there aren't a lot of opportunities to share moulds and share parts the way you can with other figure lines. So every character kind of feels unique, and again, Gordon is pitch perfect. I think they've done a wonderful job rendering him. Overall, Gordon has pretty strong articulation. Being a much larger character, he has much chunkier joints, which are a lot stronger and sturdy. So he does have great neck articulation there, so he can bend his head up and down and look from side to side with no problems whatsoever. The ball joint and shoulder allows the arms to go all the way back to the sides there, which is great. And of course, he's got that ball in the elbow as well, which again has a huge range of motion there, and it just looks fantastic. And one of the pleasing things, of course, is that he does have his trench coat, but it's made with a really soft rubber, which thankfully doesn't hinder or get in the way of the articulation at all, so they've done a really nice job with this. And it also goes some way to hide some of the unseemly joints that we see, say, in the hips, for example. So I think they've done a really nice job. It feels nice and luxurious, kind of heavy, but also, like I said, soft, which is crucial. Also, they've been clever in the fact that it doesn't look any different to the shading on the arms. Now, sometimes when you use rubber and plastic, they can have different colours, but this is shaded perfectly, so it almost looks seamless. The only time the coat gets in the way is if you're trying to bend the legs backwards. That's when you get a little bit more resistance, but that's not a position you're going to want to put him in too often. His shoes are a little bit disappointing because they are a bit more restricted on the cuffs of the trousers there, so he can't really bend his forwards up or down. For accessories, he does of course come with his own display stand, a pair of closed fists, a pair of open hands, a pistol, and his loud hailer. He holds his pistol quite well. It's not perfect though. He can't get his finger on the trigger, which is a real shame, and there is always the danger you feel like it's kind of going to slip out of his hand. However, the loud hailer is much better. That seems a lot tighter, and again, we can see that his finger gets on this or the trigger there nice and easily. So that looks a lot snugger, a lot tighter grip. But overall, these are minor gripes because I think he does hold them well enough, and you can put him in certain positions and you can't really notice. So for me, so long as he holds the weapon, that's the key thing. And this looks really good. I think, yeah, again, I think it's a really great look, and I think they've done a fantastic job. The last figure in today's video is going to be Bullock. Again, Bullock is a giant figure. He's absolutely huge for this line. And once more, visually just brilliant. So they've just ripped this figure directly from the screen, and he looks incredibly authentic. And I just think, visually very appealing. I just think they've done a fantastic job of bringing him to life. One of the things I'd note about both Bullock and Gordon is that actually their joints seem a lot more fluid. They're not as stiff as some of the earlier figures, and I think part of that is because they're not using just purely hard plastic. So it seems as the series has gone along, they've got a lot better at making these joints smoother and easier to move. And it might help again, of course, with them being much bigger figures. But yeah, the articulation here is just as we saw with the Gordon, really. Not too different, but really works really, really well with these figures. They get a lot more out of their joints, which is fantastic. I'd say there's some resistance at the wrist there in terms of where it meets the cuff, so you can't really get the most out of that hinge joint as you'd like. Again, the hips, they're always unpleasant, but they are hidden a little bit by the trench coat, which again is the same rubber that we saw on Commissioner Gordon. However, his knees are much lower down, so you're not really getting a huge range of motion there, to be honest. Like, it doesn't really kick back that much. And likewise, the feet don't really have a lot of giving them, they don't really hinge at all. For accessories, Bullock comes with his display stand, a shotgun. He also comes with his pistol as well, a closed pair of fists, an open pair of hands, handcuffs, a donut, and a half-eaten donut. And there's such a lot here that you get within in terms of the accessories that you're creating a whole range of different looks and dynamic poses that you can put him in that make this a really fun figure to have in the collection. Again, my only real gripe is the fact that he can't really hold his shotgun too well, so although I love that he's got this and I think it's a really exciting accessory, it doesn't really fit into his hand very well, to be honest. Again, he can't get his finger on the trigger, and there is that danger that it just seems to slip out of his hand more often than not. But overall, he is a really cool figure, and I'm really pleased to have him as part of this lineup. The last thing I want to look at in today's video is the Bat Signal. This was released as part of a special, I suppose, a 3-pack. You had the Bat Signal and you had Batman and Robin, which also had the flexible capes that you could use for the vehicles. I think this is a really cool thing. It's something I've always wanted. It works, it lights up, it shines the Bat Signal, and of course it's in scale. It's a very simple design, but it works really well. And it's a lovely bit of kit that just really builds the world and the environment. It has 3 wheels, 2 on the outside that you can see and 1 underneath, which allow it to be pushed and rolled around. However, it doesn't really seem to work that well, to be honest. Mine's pretty stiff and it never really feels like it's properly rolling along. It is hinged, so you can arch it straight up or to the side, which is fantastic. Again, nice to have that range of motion there. And here of course we have the switch, so when you pull this lever down, the light goes on, and the Bat Signal is projected onto the wall or the ceiling. This is a really cool effect, and obviously it works a lot better in the dark than it does in the daylight, but hopefully this gives you some indication, some idea of what to expect from it. It is a pretty cool thing. Obviously the closer it is to the subject, whether it's the wall or the ceiling, then the more impressive and the more distinct the Bat Signal is going to be. The further away it is, the more indistinct and bigger it's going to be, but still a pretty cool thing. I love having this. I think it's one of those display pieces that will act as a centerpiece to whatever display you've got going on. It's a really big size, as you can see here. It's taller than the figures, and it just helps create that environment, that world of the Dark Knight. It just looks fantastic. I think it's a really brilliant prop to have, and I think the other figures around it look really brilliant as well. It just brings everything to life and just gives it, a sense. It creates more of the world, and this is just a really fun thing to have. So I'm really glad they did this, and I love that it has the functionality of actually shining the Bat Signal. I hope you enjoyed the vid. If you did, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe, as I will be posting more videos soon.